My name is Roger Undy, and I'm going to focus just on union mergers and be rather more parochial, because Jeremy was covering the wider scene, particularly Europe, and what he thought about wider federations, as well as looking at some internal organisation of unions. This is a book that my university's published, which is Oxford, recently. So if you want to know more about it, I know one or two people in the audience have read it already, but if you want to know more about what I'm saying about British trade union mergers, it's in there and it's on offer at the moment. So following up a sort of cycle of technology where you can print on demand, you can get it cheaper. So if you look at this, which is in your pack, you'll find it's got the headings that I'm going to speak to. And as I say, it's going to be more parochial, and it's focused on British unions. So first of all, in terms of looking forward at mergers to 2020, if you were to say, well, how can we assess whether those mergers are going to accelerate or decelerate, and why they're going to take place at all, then I would suggest you've got to look at merger motivations and outcomes. And I would argue that the categories I've got down, job territory, political objectives and means, which you can see in front of you, will help you take a view as to whether or not mergers are perhaps going to accelerate in the future. So just to take two examples off that list. For example, if you were looking around and say which unions might merge in the next few years, then one of the things you might say about job territory is which area of job territory is under most pressure from the present depression, which companies are threatening to sack the most workers in the following period, and which territories have got competing unions who, by merging together, can improve their capacity in that territory. And then secondly, particularly if you're looking at transfers, the other question to pose, which is under my administration heading, is, are those unions going bust? Did one of them put its money into Icelandic banks? Was there some tendency to borrow without being able to assure that you could repay the borrowing? Are they relying on investment income to cover the big gap between subscription income and what they're actually spending? And if you get a combination of those two together, then you're probably looking at unions that are wanting to talk to each other sometime up to 2020 about possible merging and probably transfers. But in terms of amalgamations, these are much more complex and come under different pressures, and I'll say a little bit about that later. So in looking forward, if you wanted to look forward, what I'm suggesting is you might take a timeline, say to 2020, and you might scan the context. Now I'm very thankful I put technological down amongst all those that I've listed as affecting the external environment. You see political, economic, social, technological and legal factors. And of course, as one of the questions I think was suggesting, it may be that political, economic and social and legal are more important in some areas than technological. But that would be for you to decide, depending which sort of industry you're in. And thirdly, in looking at it, you've got to take some sort of position as to whether you think this thing is rational or not. And I think that's the starting point if you're looking at mergers, is to assume there's a certain rational choice and that people are deliberately opting to merge rather than to stay independent. And as such, there should be some kind of cost-benefit analysis as to whether that merger is going to be better than staying as you are independent. But in talking about rationality, this is not an economic rationality, but it is a maximisation of return. And also, it's not a rationality that's devoid of the organisation or the institutions in which you operate. So you see over the page on 4 merger scenarios for 2008 to 20 that I've got some key drivers which I've listed as possibly helping to explain whether or not you're going to see a growing merger movement or a deceleration or what. But in the middle I've put unique, so that there's an argument, and I think it's quite a strong one, that if unions are looking forward and they wish to take a view as to whether or not it's in their interest to look towards merger in this period, then they are very much influenced by their own context and by their own organisation, by their own institutional rules and representations. And also, you may have noted on the front page of my factors, the bottom one is leadership imperatives. And of course, it's not unknown for mergers to be influenced by leadership imperatives. For example, careers are critical. At least some mergers have only occurred when one General Secretary took early retirement in order to let the other General Secretary become the General Secretary of the new union. In some cases, it's been important to secure the full-time officers' pension scheme because that's going bust. In other areas, it's very important that leaders have particular affection for particular types of democratic ethos, and they want their ethos to prevail in the new union, not that of the partner they're talking to. So when I say unique in the middle, I'm bringing those factors in particular the role of the leadership, who will promote the union and promote the merger, and largely determine the way in which it's presented to the activists and to the members, and the way the decision is made as to whether or not to merge. So looking forward, if you take scenario 1, the economy is depressed, the Conservatives are in power, and there's some 70% of trade union members in 2 unions. Now, how do we get there? Well, without knowing much about what's happening in the merging world, one of the assumptions is that when it crops up under 3, that unite doesn't divide, so it still stays as one union into the future. And some would say that's a bit ambitious at the moment, but if we're saying unite continues into the future, you might also say, well, who else would form a major union? And history suggests that unions that have failed to form a major union look for a merger in order to compensate for what's gone. It also suggests that unions that feel themselves displaced by other mergers tend to look round for a merger to restore their position. So if I was to chance my arm, and I hope nobody's present from either union, I would suggest that if we were looking forward, the other union would probably be Unison and GMB, merged in order to give themselves a very strong base in the public sector with the ability to challenge the unions of the private sector. If that was to happen, and you've got 2 unions competing for mergers on this basis, then I would also see probably UCAT, possibly USDOR, but I'm not so sure about USDOR, and possibly the Communication Workers Union before 2020, having to look for somewhere else to go. And if they did, then of course there's enormous competition if you've got 2 giants wanting to mop up anything that moves, regardless of whether it fits with their job territory or not. So looking forward, if that's the case, then it accelerates the point that Jerry was making, which is what you've got a big concentration of a large part of the TUC's membership in 2 unions, which leaves quite a number of small unions wondering what the service is and how the TUC is going to perform. And also I would suggest, if the economy is depressed and membership are falling, then the subscriptions that very big unions pay to the TUC, if they're in financial difficulties, will become an area for consideration as to whether or not they're getting the money for that kind of payment. So looking forward, you can start to paint a different scenario about what happened. Then on the right-hand side, the economy revives, Labour's in power, so there's no further detrimental change in legislation. Unite grows, that is, it doesn't divorce. It stays a major player, and there's competition very much for transfers, but no more mega amalgamation between 2008 and 2020. The membership stabilises, the TUC is more stable, although as Jerry was saying, it's still got some difficulties. So if you want to examine your position, you may recognise that what I put down as TOES is SWOT in reverse, which is business school talk for the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats that you may want to look at as you develop your strategy. And what I've done briefly is to list down there, if you put your own scenario in, then you can start to calculate as to how far a merger offers you a plus or a minus in a particular context in terms of the threats that comes to the environment, the opportunities the environment offers, your weaknesses in organisation and your strengths in organisation. And if you're doing the latter bit, what you would do is go through all those headings particularly looking at what it was the leadership was attempting to achieve. Thank you.